So delighted to be here, and it's incredible that we can all come together for this summit at this time. And I think we've got an exciting session that is no doubt very topical. So we all know around the world, countries have been struggling with the health and economic implications of COVID. And the OECD has estimated that there's a 2% drop in GDP for every month of extended restrictions for a country. So that's obviously a huge challenge. For Australia as well, and around 80% of the world's workforce has had their workplace fully or partially closed. A very big part of countries getting started again, and to be able to do this in a safe way, has to do with being able to rapidly track and trace instances of COVID in society. And countries around the world have been rushing to build COVID tracing applications to support their track and trace efforts. So some of those countries include Norway, Singapore, Israel. These were some of the early adopters. And obviously here in Australia, the Prime Minister has made having a contact tracing app with high adoption rates as one of his key preconditions for opening up the economy again. And we're now seeing restrictions lifted across the country. So with that background, I'm delighted to introduce Peter Alexander, who is the Australian Government Chief Digital Officer at the Digital Transformation Agency. Peter was also previously the CIO at the Australian Treasury, and he and the DTA team recently led the delivery of COVIDSafe at an incredible pace, actually, just 4 weeks from start to go live. I mean, and in that time, there've been really significant successes. So the app has been downloaded 6.5 million times, which I think makes it probably one of the highest take-up rates for a COVID tracing app compared with other countries, and also just probably the fastest downloaded app, I think, in Australia for quite some time. And it was also recently awarded gold at the Gov Design Awards 2020 by DrivenX Design. So Peter, delighted to have you join us for this really interesting and topical discussions.
Thanks, Sek.
So to start with, maybe you could tell us a little bit about COVIDSafe and how it works, what data it collects, and how it supports contact tracing efforts.
Sure. So COVIDSafe is fundamentally an app that has been designed to support the manual contact tracing efforts of the Australian government and us working with states and territories who primarily have responsibility for health outcomes in Australia and run contact tracing for various activities. So COVIDSafe itself as an app uses Bluetooth. It does handshakes between phones. It pings, connects phones that are close to each other, fundamentally to identify if someone is a close contact. And the purpose of that is to support those manual and existing efforts where in a situation like COVID-19 or a virus type outbreak where you might have a close contact with someone but not know that and pass on the virus. So it is set to help with those. So the way it works is on your device, you download the app, it then runs that Bluetooth protocol, sending those handshakes or making those handshakes work. And then when you register, we collect your phone number as part of your registration, your age range, your location, postcode, and we store that on a server so that and only then if you are tested positive, a third party, a medical professional verifies that, and you consent to your data being uploaded. That handshake data is uploaded, and then additional close contacts can be tested and measured out of that. It's pretty basic, really, in that sense, in terms of how it operates and runs.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific. Now, we'll get on to sort of some of the design of the app because I think that's sort of really interesting. Getting to such a fast uptake rate and having so many downloads has really required some pretty careful design considerations. I mean, if I just think about, Australia is a pretty privacy conscious society. And to make this work, I think the teams had to think a lot about app functionality, privacy, the user interface, So can you just tell us a bit about some of the key design decisions that were made and the trade-offs that were involved in making those decisions?
Yeah, sure. So there were a range of privacy enhancing, security enhancing considerations that were made in terms of how this application would run and operate. And there was a really big focus on how we would take those forward, how we would design the application. And so in terms of trade-offs, I guess they were considered not trade-offs, but just ways the app would operate and work. And so fundamentally, I guess one of the really big decisions we made early on was that we wouldn't include something like GPS, like specific location data, which if you think about contact tracing and tracking a virus, location data might have been quite useful, but the purpose of the app wasn't that. It was to support manual contact tracing. So there was a decision made not to collect location data. So what we did do though, in terms of privacy and security, we did privacy impact assessments. We had source code reviewed by a bunch of security agencies. We did release the source code, and some of you would know that was a couple of weeks after release. Primarily, that was around just making sure we got it right and tidied up, noting that we didn't have a lot of time to build the app and get it out. There was privacy legislation passed, which was a first for Australia in terms of this type of application, and had some really stringent requirements around who could access the application, how it would operate, and what we would do with the data that we'd collected at the end of this. So I think in terms of that design, that was really carefully well thought through. We did a lot of work around accessibility and getting accessibility experts to review the app and make sure it worked. One thing that was interesting is we also looked at children using the application and how that would work for minors. And there was a bunch of consideration in terms of how that would work. I mean, we ended up landing with a get your parents to agree model, because we did look to build consent steps in and various bits and pieces, but they really complicated the app. And the decision was made better to not complicate it and have a process, given there are a number of controls around accessing the data and use of the data that health professionals would be involved in, and we did have the age range of the person, and they could make some decisions as part of that process. And so, as of the 16th of June, we've had 5 releases of the app. We've got one coming out this week, and every single one of those releases has been about increasing the performance, the usability, making privacy better, and accessibility better. So, I think we've done a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I think in some ways, there were areas where perhaps the app could have collected even less data than it already does. So, I mean, the app really does collect a minimum amount of information. It does ask for a name I think a postcode, whereas in other apps around the world, they literally just ask for a phone number. So any thoughts on sort of how we ended up with, collecting a name and postcode?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually really, really simple, which was that if someone's data was uploaded, so say I ended up having COVID-19 and was diagnosed, and you and I had a series of pings that would have made us a close contact. When the health professional rings you up, would go to ring you up, by having your name, by having your age range first, they would say, if there was 5 people, they would say, we'll contact the oldest person first, who tend to have the worst outcomes with COVID-19. And then when they ring you up, they would know where you are. So because we're not collecting location data, having your postcode means the New South Wales Health Authority would ring you, or the Victorian Health Authority, rather than that being confused. But also they could ring you up and say, hey, Sek, I'm a health authority ringing up about this, rather than just, oh, hello, are you the owner of mobile phone number XYZ? It was to try and make it a little bit more personal, and that first interaction a bit more human, rather than anything else. There was no, we're collecting the people's names for any other purpose than that.
Yeah, terrific. Okay. Now, if I look around the world and compare COVIDSafe to other countries, you know, some countries have taken a more decentralized and automated approach to their contact tracing apps. So people will be automatically messaged if they've been in close contact with someone who's tested positive for COVID-19. And that's the sort of model which Norway, Israel, and Singapore use. Whereas Australia has adopted for a more centralized approach where we do have a database held centrally of pings, and that's accessible by state and territory health officials to do sort of manual contact tracing processes. So can you tell us about why Australia's opted for that approach and what the key drivers for that were?
Yeah, so, I mean, it was basically because we decided that this process would support manual contact tracing efforts rather than bringing something more automated. And there's probably two main drivers to that. One was a lot of the automated processes enable an individual to self-select that they've got COVID and change their status within the application to that they've been diagnosed with COVID-19 or the disease, which is really problematic because you know, you might have an individual who, for whatever reason, changes their status, and then a bunch of people get notified, go to self-isolate when they don't have to, you know, have freak out, have bad responses, and you know, race to doctors or whatever it might be when they just don't need to because that person actually doesn't have COVID-19. So we thought it was important to have that third-party verification in, and then the notification not to be automatic for the same reason that a health professional ringing someone and talking to them, or a state and territory health official ringing someone and talking to them was much more valuable because they could then talk through with that person where they were at, what their circumstances were, you know, if they were feeling sick or not, because it has different approaches to response. Sure, self-isolation is a really important part, but if someone's feeling well, there isn't necessarily a need for them to rush to a doctor or rush to get tested. Where we are now, it's slightly different to when we launched because the number of cases is so low and testing is relatively available. If you think back 4, 6, 8 weeks, testing was kind of being challenged in terms of our ability to get tests done and get people tested. So that was really important in terms of that. But overwhelmingly, that approach was to put public health officials at the centre and make sure they stayed at the centre of the process. I mean, if you think about the way governments and countries respond to health issues and contact tracing issues, there's generally two approaches. There's a community health response, which is where you would see messaging. You see that commonly with things like, say, sexually transmitted diseases, where you would go to a doctor and the doctor would say, you know, you've got this sexually transmitted disease. You should go and tell all your sexual partners. It's then up to you to go and do that. That's kind of community where it's a message from me to someone. I might send a bunch of SMSs, I might not. But the ramifications of not doing so you know, they're important, but they're different to a public health response, which is the standard to a virus outbreak or a contamination outbreak, which is significant, but also you won't know a lot of the people that you might infect or be infected by. And so you have no ability to reach out to them, where that public health contact tracing is much more important. Also, public health officials understanding centres and locations of where outbreaks may occur, where that discussion with that person can make that clear. You know, you're on a bus, yes, we understand that, we better talk to everyone on that bus, or you're on an aeroplane, we better talk to everyone who's on that aeroplane, where the automated messaging probably doesn't have the same impact and ability for tracing.
So you actually get a much richer, more holistic public health response through this approach than just automatic text messages going out to people saying you've been in close proximity to someone.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think brings us to the next question around the technology in this space. Now, one of the big developments in the COVID contact tracing space has been Apple and Google saying that they're working together and they're releasing APIs that supports automated contact tracing. So given what we've just talked about, is that something that's on the cards for Australia? I know other countries have been looking at adopting this, but is this something that we're looking at, and what are the key considerations that we've been thinking through?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of contacts with Apple and Google on that approach, and we've been working very collaboratively together and in lockstep in this approach and the enhancements to their Bluetooth capabilities. Well, primarily Apple's Bluetooth operating model, and that exposure notification framework, they call it the ENF model, is very similar for those companies. And they've done really good work. They've got doctors employed in their organisations and taken this approach forward. I guess the challenge for a sovereign nation like Australia and lots of other sovereign nations is the approach that Apple have kind of Apple Google have generally put out there is to take on the Apple Google ENF. You have to take it holus bolus. You can't just take the Bluetooth enhancements. You need to take their whole framework, and it is a different framework to ours. So, for example, we do the Bluetooth handshake, the ping every 1 minute. They do it every 5 minutes. They do the community tracing kind of approach, where it's a message from an individual to another individual, and then you could build that into a health professional or to a public health official. It really significantly changes our tracing approach. And so we're working with them and looking at it. We would love just to take the Bluetooth enhancements. And from our testing, there are some Bluetooth enhancements. Absolutely, it would enhance Bluetooth, particularly for Apple. The Android ecosystem is very strong already in the way the Bluetooth works. We've done lots of testing. It's excellent across the board. Google is probably less so on a locked device to a locked device. We'd rate that kind of as moderate. And this would definitely enhance that. So we are looking at how we could do work with that. It is fundamentally a challenge. We've considered lots of things. Do we build a second application and run them? I mean, we can't really run them. They wouldn't be interoperable as two applications. But we are considering kind of how it would work and what it does. One of the really big considerations is the opportunity for international interoperability. If everyone across the world was on ENF, we could have an interoperable international tracing framework. So I think you'll see development. So maybe COVID-19, the response will be more like what we've got now, but for the next, hopefully not, but of course, knowing where we stand, we all expect there'll be something after this. There'll be, COVID-20 or something down the track, a SARS or something where we will need a similar response. And so I think the future options where the ENF will have its biggest impact.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really interesting and fits very much with the theme of this conference, which is about building technology that works for humanity and the systems that, the sort of human systems and processes that we have in place, not just adopting the technology out there, but the approach that you've taken is fitting with the way that Australia does contact tracing and the way that state and territory health officials around the country do their jobs. I might skip ahead and just talk a bit about the end-to-end development of COVIDSafe. Now, that was extremely quick, just 4 weeks to develop a pretty complex product. And I can't think of an instance in which something quite as complex has been developed quite as fast, particularly in public sector, but also in the private sector. So I'm sure this has been a terrific learning experience. There were a huge number of challenges involved, but can you just share a bit about how this was successfully achieved and some of the delivery challenges you encountered doing this?
I agree. It was an excellent effort, and I think the way it was achieved was an excellent collaboration, unity of purpose, a focus on speed and agility, and to be honest, a bunch of people who worked ridiculous hours and kind of put their lives on hold for the last 2 weeks particularly, but probably that full 4 weeks. It was exceptional on the teams, both private and public sector. We had partners from from the private sector, Boston Consulting, Amazon Web Services, Shine, Delve, GoSource. We had a number of private sector partners. In the public sector, Department of Health, Attorney General's Department, Home Affairs for a small part. We did a lot of really good work with really good tech teams and really clever people about thinking how this could work. And particularly towards the end, we also had excellent engagement with the Information and Privacy Commissioners from federal government and across the nation, and the health officials, the chief medical officers from the jurisdictions and federally as well, to kind of get the requirements right and get those built. And of course that was excellent, but also challenging because that meant requirements shifted a little bit late, and particularly in the last week caused a huge challenge for us. But it was an amazing team effort, and I think the consequence of that, which we've copped a lot of flack, and kind of happy to do so most of the time. But we did release this app as an MVP, knowing that in the first period it would be collecting data and probably wasn't going to be used in anger as much as it would, in the following period. So we knew we released it with a few areas that we needed to fix in updates. And so we had a classic agile approach where we released the MVP and then we're set to iterate. And of course, that brings a challenge where, of course, we're going to be criticised for that, where someone will say this feature isn't perfect, that feature isn't perfect. And I guess we were a bit of that. But I think, in general,
in the public sector, I think is actually quite difficult, particularly when you've got such a huge amount of tension on this app. It was the Prime Minister had foreshadowed the app was coming. There was it was going to go out on a particular day. I mean, most I think apps in other settings can release something small, try it. It can be a bit clunky, it's fine. But I think that this app had to be pretty bulletproof when it went out the first time. So I'm sure that was an enormous challenge for the team.
There was a hilarious conversation we had about 3 days before it went out with a bunch of our private sector partners, and one of them, a very senior guy in one of those companies, said, why don't we just delay it a week, and we'll do this and we'll do that, and it just makes sense, we could delay it a week. And I guess not getting that imperative, which is the private sector versus public sector. Everyone's got deadlines, right? I get that, but we had no ability to slip. The Prime Minister had made it, set a date, that was the date, and we were delivering on that date. So we did get that done, but we had that significant set of challenges, and we had to have privacy right, we had to have security right, we had to have accessibility right, and we had to have the functionality of the app right on that release to that MVP level. Yeah,
fantastic. I'm sure it's a experience that probably won't be repeated for quite some time to come. Now, the DTA more broadly, you've got a really exciting program of work to improve digital government services. So it'd be great to hear a bit about what are the big things on the horizon for the DTA, and what is it that the DTA has taken away and learned through COVIDSafe that impacts the work that you do going forward?
So I mean, the DTA is a whole of government organisation in the federal government, but we also do a lot of work across states and territories. The big areas of focus for us over the coming period are implementing the digital transformation strategy, which basically has tranches around getting a fitter government, a fitter public service to deliver, building the capabilities and skills of the public sector, using data and digital technologies, AI, analytics capabilities better across government to make better decisions and deliver better services, and then to build and deliver better services across government. And my role as the Chief Digital Officer is to focus particularly on that last area, which is around digital services. So we're doing things like whole of government digital identity, whole of nation digital identity. We're really focused on that and using that to make it easier for Australian individuals and businesses to interact with government. That's a really big focus. Taking MyGov forward, making it a better platform. If you visit MyGov, you'll see there's a beta link on the homepage where we've got the future of MyGov now available from last weekend. where we're looking to make, as I say, make MyGov just better. We're doing a lot around hardening government IT and cyber security and how we make that work. But at its heart, we have one overriding mission, which is to take government services and build them into user journeys and think about putting people at the centre, how they interact with government and the type of services they get, and how we deliver them in ways that are meaningful to them, whether that's a human delivering that service, whether that's an application on a device, or some combination in between. I think we're working on how we take the federal public service forward, but also working with industry and states and territories to think about those. If you have a baby in Australia, you don't just deal with the federal government, you deal with state government, you deal with private sector. How do we make that experience better for you?
Yeah. Oh, that's certainly a very ambitious agenda. And, you know, I'm sure there's lots more to do, particularly as a result of COVID, where in some ways, you know, COVIDSafe has been one of the key signature things that the DTA has worked on to get Australia back. But in a post-COVID world, the demand for digital services will be even greater. So the work that you're doing with the DTA across the whole of government, both federal and state and territory, I think is massively important. Even more now.
And I'll probably answer the second part of your question, which the biggest lesson out of COVIDSafe is if you've got unity of purpose and you've got support by your executive, and in our case, Cabinet and the Prime Minister, you can get a lot done with limited resources in a short time. It is, when you're motivated, you can get things done.
Yep, terrific. Adina, I think we might pause there for the time being, and I think we're both happy to take any questions.
Right, thank you. That was indeed a lot to take in and very interesting. And the questions are, of course, coming through thick and fast. So please, people do upvote, questions that you'd like to see answered and add your own. One that's been getting a lot of likes here is just about how you assess the effectiveness of the app and what metrics are you observing?
Yeah, so I guess there's been a couple of, there's a range of metrics we're looking at. I mean, the headline one, which you would see published all the time, is downloads and the view of government around volume being an excellent metric, and it is a good metric. And getting lots of people to download and use the application is important. So we measure downloads, of course, and we talk about those, but we also measure use of the application. So we know how many people are using it because the temp ID that you get that identifies an individual in those handshakes is refreshed every 2 hours. And so we know people who are not just have the application, but are running it because of that. So we can measure whether that is working well. But overwhelmingly, the effectiveness of this application is measured through its use. And so you would have seen potentially some media saying the app hasn't been used. It's never been used in anger. It's never been tested, which isn't correct. States and territories have used the application, and the back end health officials portal. They have tested close contacts. They've got close contacts from the application. They've engaged with them, and there have been cases where the application has generated contacts for public health officials to talk to that they might not have had through manual tracing. So that for us is the ultimate success in measurement, that it has a beneficial outcome. But also, we are doing a lot of work around the technical aspects of the application. So how the Bluetooth works. We've done a lot of testing and measurement of the effectiveness of Bluetooth. And, you would have potentially also seen a bunch of material and media saying, it was poor at the start, it's poor now. Not the case. Certainly when we first released the application, iPhone, lock, it was not great in terms of the pings out of over a 15-minute period. We might have got 4 pings potentially reliably from locked Apple devices. That's certainly gone up as we've done Bluetooth enhancements. We've got a really nice piece of Bluetooth enhancement code from the UK, and that has been really beneficial to us. So we are constantly measuring how we make it better, and we're getting a lot of feedback from the public, and particularly from IT experts. And when we get that, we assess it. And there's been a number of enhancements we've made to the app where we have had that engagement with either the security community or the general IT community.
Yeah, I think some of the headline figures on the app metrics can be a little bit unhelpful, like the number of people that have been tracked and traced as a result of the app. Well, in a world in which actually Australia doesn't have many instances at the moment, that figure is obviously going to be low. But as we open up, I think we'll hopefully see more. Well, hopefully won't see more people getting COVID, but the app should be able to track and trace more people as there are more. There's more instances of that throughout the community.
Yep.
Right. They did mention, there was a second part to that question, just about when you are evaluating these metrics, will you be making this evaluation public for others to learn from and see?
So I would say, in the retrospective of this, absolutely. I think there will be a bunch of data that will be released, and conversations and consideration had at a de-identified kind of macro level, statistical kind of analysis of how we can do what we got from this process, what the manual contact tracing efforts were like across the jurisdictions, where COVIDSafe was beneficial, and what and how it could have done better, I guess, where it was good, where it could have done better. And I think that will that type of data will absolutely be released. I wouldn't expect during the process a lot of data to be released, noting that a lot of the useful data is public health official contact tracing data and measurement, and they don't tend to release that anyway. Like you don't see, for example, in the manual arrangements today, you don't see, unless they're saying who was on, we need people who are on seats 8 to 16 on a plane, certain plane from a certain location. They don't say, person X has been diagnosed with COVID and, they had 500 close contacts that we're investigating. It just doesn't happen like that. That's not how contact tracing works.
Thank you. There was one here that's got a lot of votes just about the percentage. So if we're saying 24% average of the population downloading the app, can it still be relied as an effective control?
So yeah, I would say, in isolation, can it be an effective control? It's not intended to be in isolation as an effective control. It is a support to the manual contact tracing. And so Paul Kelly, one of the deputy chief medical officers, talked about percentages, and there was all this discussion about if there was 40%, 60%, what's the number that was the target? I mean, in reality, it is supporting existing manual processes. So if it was 1%, or even I guess to be really micro-focused, if it saved one person, if it said one person was identified with COVID who otherwise wouldn't have been, and then didn't go on to spread it in a community, that's effective. I know that sounds like a bit of a cop-out at a level, but every person who doesn't get it is effective. And I think this is one of the things where you look at the Australian and New Zealand response to COVID. Every life is sacred. Every person we can save from getting sick or, worst case dying is really important to us. Where some other nations have had a slightly different approach and said, we're going to treat our nation as a percentage of people, and we're going to think about how these things work. In Australia, it has been every life is precious. Let's save every life and keep everyone as healthy as we can. Hence the response of Australia and our kind of macro response. But percentages, is 24% good? It's amazing if you think about the way applications have rolled out and application uptake in Australia. There's not many applications that have more than 24% that aren't like Facebook or Angry Birds. The numbers are low with applications generally and how they're downloaded. So for a government application, it is amazing.
Yeah, and I'd just say from the global perspective, I've just been looking at the numbers over the last week. You know, Australia would probably be in the top 5 of countries around the world that have COVID tracing apps in terms of adoption amongst the total population. So I think after Iceland, which has quite a small population and 40% adoption, you know, and Norway, I think Australia is pretty much next. So I think that's, you know, in the global sense, we're actually doing really well. And then I think, as Peter said, the model in Australia is about supplementing manual contact tracing processes, whereas I think in some other countries, this COVIDSafe, the equivalent of COVIDSafe, is the contact kind of track and trace method. They don't have as strong a manual tracing effort. So when we supplement our manual tracing effort with COVIDSafe, even at 25%, I think it's quite a strong outcome.
Great. Next question we have that says, with the emergence of Google and Apple contact tracing APIs, how quickly can COVIDSafe pivot from roll your own infrastructure to industry standardized infrastructure?
I guess there's 2 parts to that question. If Apple and Google just let us use their Bluetooth enhancements, so they've done, particularly in the Apple case, they've done an updated version of their operating system of iOS. If you go into Apple now, into a bunch of settings, you can see that there's a contact tracing switch on off. It needs an application to switch on. But if they just let us use that as part of our model, we could switch to that really quickly. The trouble, as I mentioned before, with ENF, and maybe not as prescriptive of this, if we went to the ENF model, our existing model will have to turn off. So it is a completely different model. It's a community it's a community model. The data we've collected, the data that people would have on their phone to date, the day we made that switch, we turned it off. You'd lose all that data. The data that we've collected, it is a completely different model. In the ENF model, individuals make choices about what data about sharing. So I would be potentially, again, if Sek and I were the example, I'm diagnosed with COVID, I make a choice, no third party. I just say, yep, I've got COVID. Sek gets a message that says, someone who may have been in close contact with you has got COVID. Do you want to share that data with the government? So the contact data also has to be consented to be shared. Completely different model. It's quite challenging. And so to pivot to the whole ENF model is substantial. Hence my point earlier, I think it would be the industry standard will be the next iteration of this type of service. You know, we might build it and have ready a government tracing capability based on ENF for the next pandemic, if there is one. Hopefully not.
Thanks. A lot of the questions here are kind of similar, echoing just the challenges that we are facing to make this more effective. So what would you say are the biggest challenges that kind of stand in your way to make this successful, and what can we do to make it better?
I feel like it is successful, and I think you know, I guess the challenge always is you know, adoption and approach, and this thing built in with Australians have been really good to date at social distancing and doing the things that we have. You know, well, lots of people have been unhappy that they can't go to football and they can't do lots of things in their normal life, and you know, equally lots of people have been happy that they haven't been going into work and working from home. We've seen this dynamic shift, I guess, in Australia's work model, and I think the future of work is going to be significantly changed by this, where work from home, work from remote location is going to be much more acceptable in lots of workplaces than probably it was in February. So, you know, I think what do we need kind of to succeed more? I think it is, you know, support good ideas, engagement, you know, and really it is up to us to build, as in government, we need to keep doing the right things and build confidence of Australians that we are delivering services that add value to their life, protect them where we need to, and you know, that's a task for government. You know, there is always the scepticism of Australians, which is a healthy scepticism. about government and what we do and how we do it and what we do with data when we collect it, all those things. It is our job to prove that, we are doing the right thing, and we are, always trying to be helping Australians, not anything more nefarious than that.
Mm. And that's actually feeds right into another question that you've kind of partially answered, but it was about how in this kind of era of fake news and skepticism rather from the people, how do you approach that in terms of getting people to understand that you are on their side and that you're trying to do the right thing?
I think that is by continually doing the right thing. I think the thing for government is to continually do the right thing, to show people that you do the right thing. I think the transparency is important. The sharing what we have. I think if you look at COVID Trace and us releasing, COVIDSafe, us releasing the source code, sure, if you're kind of 2 weeks later than some people would have liked, but we don't do that often in government. I think the big lesson for the Australian government is that we can take is the UK government tend to be a lot more open in release of source code and other content. We can get better at that, and that is something we need to be kind of more adept in doing and being prepared for. We wanted to make sure that it was fully security reviewed. Any errors were taken out. Any commentary by coders was taken out. And so we went through a process where we did that to get it out. I think we've got to be a bit braver and release it. But the quid pro quo there is when we release it, someone doesn't criticise us for a bit of content that is irrelevant to the operation of the app, but is some description written by a coder.
Great. Well, we'll probably wrap up shortly, but just before you go, first of all, thank you so much again for sharing all of that. It's been really, really intriguing. Just interested to know what kind of keeps you up at night? What worries you the most about rolling this out further?
So the things that have stressed me and my team and the broader team have been getting it right, making it work, delivering on the outcome we need to do, being cost effective, and always keeping that focus on supporting public health officials to do their job better, stopping one Australian, 100 Australians, 1,000 Australians from getting COVID-19 is kind of the mission. And so the thing that always keeps us focused is doing that. Making the thing that we're really focused on at the moment is, making the app as efficient as we can in terms of that Bluetooth operation. We'll release this week where we're going to do further enhancements to Bluetooth. I think that is the thing that just keeps us going on it.
Thank you. And Sek, did you have anything to add that's worrying you?
Not for me. I think Peter's covered that well. I think broadly data breaches and just making sure that the app doesn't have as few false negatives as possible, which I know there's been a lot of work on the Bluetooth signal, but Peter and the team are leading that work. We've stepped back, but it's really thrilling to see how it's gone, how it's been delivered so quickly, and the improvements that are being pushed through right now, particularly in a very privacy cautious environment like Australia. So thank you very much, Peter, for sharing the perspectives with us. And thanks, Adina, for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sek. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.